Yeah. Something that was just coming through even in the past 24 hours as I was thinking about this conversation. I also listened to your conversation about the fraud or the boyfriend who kind of took over the accounts and that sort of stuff. That was really helpful because I feel like that's sort of the tone is this inner journey or what's happening for someone, and they might not understand what's going on with their money situation. So what came through as I was listening to that was a lot of my work is very trauma informed. And so, what I found from my own life story and working with people and their money for 30 years is that, and there's data, and we can talk about it. The CDC Kaiser ACEs study. Do you know about that? Adverse childhood
No.
experiences. Okay. So, it's a study that was done with 17,000 people over 1995 to 1997. And what they came away realizing was when you have adverse childhood experiences, there are all these things that happen later in life. And the one that has been least discussed, which has really motivated my work because I knew there was a problem, but I couldn't find research about it, is that financial problems come just like obesity, just like drug abuse, just like other problems in people's lives. So they lead these adverse childhood experiences lead to health challenges, money challenges, adult health and risk behaviors. And so I came at it from the, CFP, working with people and their money versus the psychology, but I knew there was a problem and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. So there may be something there because a lot of people we know the finance side of it and people blame themselves like I must be doing something wrong. But in reality, this data says it is not your fault. There is a good chance that some things that happen later and earlier in life are actually contributing to some of the challenges you faced. And so it's a forgiveness. It's a self-forgiveness. I want the audience to walk away thinking, I'm okay, even though it's been a rough road and I might not be FI yet, that if I can just understand this better and understand myself better, then I can actually catch myself. And we can talk about that, like be less reactive, make less stupid decisions, that sort of thing. That's what came through.
All right, everyone, we are going to be following up on the incredible episode that we did with Rachel Partleton talking about overcoming and battling financial abuse. For more context, that was episode 246 of our podcast. We're speaking today with Lisa Peterson from the Wealth Clinic, her website, wealthclinic.com. She has a brand new book out called The Mindful Millionaire. And in this episode, as you basically heard, we're going to build on some of the financial trauma that we heard earlier, in that past episode 246. What's the why behind that? And if people recognize that, self-identify with some of those characteristics, what can they do about it? How can they start grabbing control back into their lives, feel that sense of agency? Very excited about this episode. And to help me with this, I have my co-host Brad here with me today. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, Jonathan, I am doing quite well. And yeah, we always say that the nuts and bolts of money, that's really the easy part. Once you learn it, that's the simple part. But it's that inner game, right? It's the psychological aspect of it. And your money story really informs so much of your life, even if we're not aware of it. And I think that's what's going to be so fascinating about this conversation today with Lisa is we're going to talk about these awakening moments. We're going to talk about scarcity and overcoming it. And we're going to talk about truly this inner journey. So with that, Lisa, welcome to Choose a Five.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Lisa, let's go back to kind of that setup for this episode. You're listening to episode 246. You're listening to Rachel share the story of financial abuse and kind of the trauma that was associated with that. And you're saying, maybe it's just not there. Maybe it actually starts sooner. And if we recognize that, we have more information and hence we have more power.
Most definitely. I think that awareness is everything. So the more we know about ourselves, the less likely we are to get caught into situations that she was describing. Because I think she didn't know that there were some seeds planted probably early in life that contributed to what happened. And this is the story that I've been researching and studying for, I feel like 30 years, ever since I started working in the money business.
So what got you into the money business in the first place? And I guess, the secondary part of that is what got you interested in psychology? Do you have any background in this at all?
I don't have a background in psychology. It's really funny. I never was into psychology in general, but what got me into the financial business is we didn't have any growing up. I wanted money. And I remember like 7 or 8, I started my own business selling door to door seeds and chocolate and anything else. I wanted money. My parents didn't have it, that they stressed about it and cried about it and fought about it all the time. And I took it upon myself that I was going to have money and not have the stresses that they had. I think that eventually led me to getting my MBA and really making a decision in my, I think, around 30 that I wanted to be, well, it's even mid 20s. I decided I want to be a millionaire. Like, why not? Even though I had no role models for that, that was a wish that I set for myself.
Yeah, I certainly read that in your book, and you dreamed of being rich, but it seemed like earning money became all consuming, right? And I wonder how much of that do you think, looking back, was informed from maybe this scarcity mindset growing up?
All of it.
Yeah.
I think that you think of, I was born in the late 60s. I grew up in a certain world where money was very much put out there as the end all be all. And so I watched a lot of TV. That was sort of my babysitter. I would gravitate to the rich people. I wanted to watch and understand them. It just became something I thought about a lot. And I think I did it in response to the trauma that was going on at home. It was like an escape. Money became my escape. And that was why I think I became so motivated by it. I thought it was my way out.
Yeah, it's interesting. Trauma, that word is a very broad word, right? And I think a lot of us have situations in our past that maybe consciously we wouldn't think of as trauma, but it might fit, especially when we're talking about finances, about it might fit that definition as you would broadly describe it of trauma. But in our mind's eye, like we don't think about it consciously, right? Like parents arguing or not being able to get something that was really critically important. Just these little things that, like, again, I probably in my mind's eye wouldn't think of it as trauma necessarily. But I mean, is that what you would say to someone, like, think back to your childhood and look for these kind of major inflection points?
I think it's a huge spectrum, and I totally hear you. Like, I've looked at this a lot. Some people have a pretty mild degree of trauma that occur in their life growing up, but there still could be these minor things that, like, they would go to the grocery store and they'd want the candy bar, and every time they'd ask for it, their parents would say, "We can't afford that," because that's what they had heard from their parents. And even though we wouldn't consider that like trauma, it literally informs someone that your parents don't have enough money to buy a candy bar, right? They're using the wrong language to explain something. It does kind of wear on you, right? But then there's also the other extreme, which is something I've, had to dive into because I had this. I was exposed to a lot of really rough circumstances growing up. And I think because of that, I see the whole spectrum that I don't label anyone like you've never been traumatized. Like that's not fair. But I also do see that sometimes we do have pretty serious things happen. Maybe the death of a parent. I mean, nobody did that to you, but it dramatically changes your life if you're a young child and you lose a parent, right? So that would be trauma. So there's a very broad spectrum. What got really curious about, and you asked me about this, is I worked with people and their money for all those years. And I would notice how some people were just totally fine with money. They could figure it out. They could work their way through problems. And then I saw a lot of people making really bad decisions on a regular basis, getting into financial trouble and not knowing how to handle situations, being very reactive. It made me very curious because even though I went to one extreme, which was I want a lot of money, I also saw that trauma could also lead people to feel like they had no control over it. It's like two extremes. That's what I started noticing and got curious about.
When you were talking about the study, really at the setup for this interview, give us a little bit more about what made you stumble on that and how that informed your work.
So I was really curious about why my clients had such different feelings and relationships with money. And I began looking everywhere I could. And I'll tell you, I really wanted to help people that I had seen struggling with their finances. And I think I just opened my eyes in all directions and, as you said, stumbled across this adverse childhood experience study that Kaiser had completed. I actually was shocked that not more attention had been given to it because, in my case, the reason the study was done was to understand health problems that were being caused by events that had occurred in someone's, childhood. But what I also found in my reading of this study was one of the line items was financial problems. And the minute I saw that, I became completely consumed because I knew that what I had witnessed for 25 plus years was there was some story that people weren't talking about that was contributing to people's struggles with finances. And that made me lean really in and realize that I was discovering something that not a lot of people were talking about.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I've heard of this study and these adverse childhood experiences. I'm actually struggling to think of the podcast episode that I heard it on. But as I understand it, there's three main types, right? There's abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, I believe. So where does that fit in? And has there been further study on how finances impact us personally, like in reference to this study in particular, or was it like largely just the jumping off point for you?
It was the jumping off point. And yes, there have been other studies, but I would honestly say there hasn't been enough study on this work still to this day. I think that's what made me curious. That's what made me build a company around it. That's what made me start asking people questions about what had happened when they were young and how might those challenges that they've had translate into what's going on for them. And I want to also connect in this other piece because what happens when we have these experiences as a child that are very disruptive is we have a uncertainty that comes along with it in the way that we look at life. It really crushes our sense of self. And that's kind of the spiritual connection that I started to realize. We struggle to gain certainty. Well, what's interesting is when you think about the concept of scarcity, there's not enough, and uncertainty, they actually go together. And I think this is why it leads us into struggling potentially with money, whether it be one extreme or the other. I have an extreme need to control, or I don't feel like I'm in any control of my money.
No, that makes sense. And just going back to what you had said before, that example of, right, we can't afford the candy bar. We're always looking for these kind of actionable tips. I feel like that's something that somebody who clearly could afford the candy bar might just kind of flippantly say to their kid. Can you give different language? Like, what would you advise? Like, is that the time at the grocery store checkout for, hey, let's have an in-depth conversation about money? Like, what would you say there? And then what would you follow it up with?
So, funny story. My son, the reason I really got this one was I had just bought a brand new car, and my son is 8 years old, and we're in line at the grocery store, and he says, "I want the candy bar," and I say, "We can't afford it," and he looks me in the eyes. He looks me in the eyes, and he's like, "You just bought a brand new car, and you can't buy me this candy bar," and I was like, I am teaching this stuff. And I was so embarrassed. And I was like, wow, if I could be doing this, then I wonder who else is doing this. So, it is about paying attention to the languaging that we use because kids are like giant sponges. They're listening to everything we say in our conversation with our spouses, in our conversations with them. And it can cause them to think, wow, there's really not enough.
This is there's a lot here. I mean, this is relationships. It's also it's kind of the direction you want to take. I would imagine in your work, you have worked with people that are trying to figure out how to get on the same page with their spouse, their partner, how, it's parents or kids that understand what's going on with their parents. It's the spectrum. But let's say that we identify this study and it points to this earlier, potentially this earlier event or series of events that now are introducing terms to us like scarcity and uncertainty. We have this language and we say, okay, maybe this erratic, reactionary, counterintuitive behavior is tied to these terms, scarcity and uncertainty, maybe, much earlier in our life. And we say we intellectually understand that. What can we do about it? Maybe you as the proactive, the person listening to this podcast right now probably is disproportionately more the one that's interested in their finances. But maybe the reason they're listening to this exact episode is because someone in their life, someone that they care about, someone that's important to them is this exact scenario. And they can't seem to communicate or translate or make the connection, interact with this individual in a way that helps them move forward towards progress. I'm curious, how do we bridge the gap from data and information to, meaningful change?
I think it starts with understanding yourself and understanding those people that are around you. Because what I've seen over and over again is when people do start to look at their backstory with money or their backstory with trauma, they can start to become more familiar. They're better able to talk to their partner about those challenges, and it's significant. But what I think makes a big change is that when people realize, first of all, just like you said, maybe there's a disconnect in our communication. Like maybe your story is so different than mine that I struggle to even understand where you're coming from. So that's the first place, is just meet up and say, maybe one of the reasons that we fight about money is that our backgrounds are so different. And my husband and I talk about this all the time. Like, we've been together for 33 years and we still talk about the fact that it informs, like, we can only know what we know from our own perspective. So the job in relationships is not just to understand ourselves, but also to see the other person and how they may be approaching money because of their backstory.
Yeah, and it's interesting how we all just put so much emotion into money, right? But it's really just this inert object that as you said in the book, money merely reflects the intentions of its user. And we put all the power of what we believe in into this, right? And so our backstory is informing, like, oh, greed is bad, or money is inherently bad, or oh, those rich people, they're X, Y, and Z. There's something negative about them. You hear all these things. You need money to make money. Like, think of all the things you hear just in passing when you're growing up, and I guess that does inform this. But like, how do you make that conscious? Like, how does someone who maybe doesn't remember these things, like how would I go about thinking about that? Even like, if I'm listening to you and I'm listening to this interview and I want to learn more about myself, in essence, like,
Yeah.
where do I start? I know that's an open-ended question, but like, where would I even start?
One of the things that feels really helpful here in just context setting is the fact that I think people may or may not know this, but when you think that something is in scarce supply, you are going to buy more of it. Okay, so now let's just use toilet paper, for example. Let's just make it really relevant to this past year. We think there's not going to be enough of the toilet paper. So we're going to go out scouting on missions to buy as much toilet paper as we possibly can. We hoard it. Now, why that's helpful and what you're asking me is, let's say your partner is different than you. They came from a home where there wasn't enough money growing up. And they have these strange buying behaviors that you don't understand. Where this starts is if you could look over and see that maybe this idea of uncertainty or scarcity is showing up in their relationship on a daily basis with money. And because you've never experienced it in your own life, it's hard for you to be compassionate about their spending behaviors and the crazy things that they do. So that's one place. It's like, just because you haven't necessarily had it, maybe your partner did. And maybe the reason they're informing, their decisions are informed from this place of scarcity. And the minute you say, oh my gosh, that must be really painful to be operating from a level of uncertainty and scarcity. How can I help them? How can we talk about this more? How can I feel more about, like, how can I relate to what's going on for them, especially in stressful times? Because I think these times are bringing some of these qualities out of people that maybe they've been lying dormant in the past. That's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, and you said in the book that many of your clients had an awakening merely by talking about money, that was just that moment. And I'm curious, so clearly we're talking about spouses or significant others who maybe have these different money stories. How would you consider somebody broaching that topic, because it is such a difficult topic to talk about? Like, how do you find that common ground to even have the first conversation?
I like to encourage people to just start somewhere. So thinking about how was money treated in our home growing up, like I write about it and then they write about it, my partner or my friend or someone, I want to have this conversation. And then we come together and we just talk about it because all of a sudden we're both helping each other get some new realizations. And just a side note, book clubs have started around my book and I've attended some of them. And this is exactly what's happening. Like the first session, people are talking about things and they're like, I have never, ever thought about how what happened growing up around the kitchen table, how it's affecting me still to this day. But just by talking about it is so healing and redeeming that I feel like I'm going to approach things differently going forward. It's really that simple.
Let's take that idea and let's just add a little bit of, a little bit of a framework or a guide to what they're actually addressing or they're looking for in their childhood. Like, talk to me about your relationship with money around the kitchen table as a child growing up. Like, but practically for that person that's like, all right, that's a little too vague. What like, is it? Did mom and dad talk about money? Did mom and dad fight about money? Did mom and dad or parents or parent struggle with money? Is there additional questions that help them get closer to actually identifying those trigger points or those pain points?
The questions you mentioned are perfect. I also would say that sometimes it isn't even just in what your parents were doing or what they were talking about, but it's also in their backstories too. So it's fascinating to me because you should ask the questions you already suggested, most definitely. And what else comes up in that mind? Like, what was your first memory of money? What was the first time you made money? How did it make you feel? Were you afraid? Some people are actually afraid when they first make money. We might assume that everybody feels great, but some people are like, "Oh no, I don't trust myself." So you're looking for these feelings of what those questions provoke, not just what happened, but also how do you feel about it? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Are there best practices to prevent conflict during these types of? These are very. They reveal, like you said, scarcity, but even more than that, your insecurity. They make you vulnerable, and when you're vulnerable, you lash out in anger because it pricks something that you don't really want to talk about. So, are there ways to do this and do it in a way that it's a safe space?
I would say that's probably one of the reasons why I like journaling so much, because I think it is hard to have these conversations for the first time with another person. It's better to have them with yourself, which is what journaling does, is you're writing it down and you're having time to contemplate, and you might cry, you might emote, you might get really angry, and you can do that in the privacy of your own space rather than with someone else. But what I also have found is step two would be, who could I feel safe sharing this with? And it may not be your partner for the first person. It might be your best friend, someone you really trust. But I love that you brought this up because each of us, depending on our backstory, depending on the answers that come to those questions, we probably want to spend a few minutes thinking, who am I going to feel really safe and supported with when I do talk about this?
Lisa, I wanted to just ask one quick thing that you mentioned in passing before. You said basically in your career you found that people relate to money very differently, right? We've talked a lot here about the majority, which are as you say, the majority, they grasp at their money tightly or avoid it altogether. But then there's that minority of people who viewed it as a tool, had mastered it and felt some peace with money. And that that seems to me, I wonder what minority that is, like what percentage, and how do you think those people got to that point? Were there specific instances, lessons they learned? Like, how does someone, I mean, honestly, how does someone feel at peace with money? It seems so countercultural. That's certainly what we're hoping for here at Choose FI and in the entire FI movement, is to get to that peace with money. But how do some people naturally find that? I guess is my ultimate question.
What I've seen in all my research with the folks that you're talking about is there was at least one role model in their life that really highlighted the idea of money being a tool versus something that needed to have all this other stuff wrapped up in it. So if you have one strong figure in your life, it changes the way that you think about it. The earlier, the better in life. And I think this really hits home to the importance of us getting our stuff together with money so that we can pass that role model relationship on to our children.
It's interesting thinking about these little childhood experiences that you never know the impact. And actually, my wife and I had a conversation with my daughter Molly yesterday over the dinner table, and I realized we might have had like a parenting fail, even though we try to have such a positive mentality about money in the house, and we're constantly talking about and we jokingly said, "Oh, Molly, you're gonna be broke when you grow up," or something, and you could actually see her almost like internalize that. I'm like, "Oh no, I think we just did something terrible." I'm hoping not, but clearly I'm hoping that the good outweighs the bad here. But I mean, is that something in your opinion? And I mean this very seriously. Should I bring that up again? Should I say Molly, we were just joking about that. Obviously, you have so many good lessons about money and you're so smart and you do this and that, right? Or do I just let it slide and hope that she doesn't remember it?
I totally sympathize. And I would say the answer to the question, based on my experience of having a 23-year-old and a 15-year-old, is I always go back. I always close the loop. And it happens on a regular basis where I realize that the message that I conveyed isn't going to set them up in the way that I want to. And I want to go back. And a lot of times my kids are like, "Oh my gosh, mom, you're making too much out of this." And I'm like, you know what? I'll bet you're going to remember this conversation, because not only am I showing you my humility and not communicating very well, but I'm also just showing you how important it is that I think you think very highly of your potential and what's possible.
It almost goes two ways, doesn't it? I mean, these types of conversations, to Brad's point, I don't want my child to be operating from scarcity or uncertainty, but I also don't want my child to be cavalier or take it for granted or, have so much security that they just assume that it's just going to take care of itself. It goes to both sides. And when you're talking about raising the second generation, the goal here is not for your kids to be financially independent because they've been given a silver spoon, but to have the tools to be able to take care of this for themselves, to be able to build on what you've built, but to do so with the confidence that it's their skill set. And so it's you don't get to, just because everything's so good and you would never have to worry about money, get to just not have these conversations. That could be its own form of trauma. I guess my question or follow-up for you is, when we talk about scarcity and uncertainty, how does this, what does this actually do to a child over a period of time, these small little jabs, if unaddressed? Yeah, and I think specifically for people in the FI community that are listening to this from a place of confidence, this is a real question. Is there such a thing as too much abundance for our kids?
I love these questions. And I'm just going to be really, really open about what goes on in our home, because I feel like that's going to help people more than anything. Both my husband and I came from conservative backgrounds, but I had a much rougher time growing up financially than he did. Then we jumpstart the fact that we've got kids a little later in life. By the time my kids are understanding money, we're self-made millionaires. And being able to teach them the things that we're talking about here, which is an understanding of the value of money, of the value of hard work, of the value of things that they are definitely getting a different read from their external experiences. My husband and I don't fight about money like I did, my parents did. What I have seen is that it's good to give them all perspectives, to talk about where we've come from, where we're living now, and what we hope they are living like in the future. Because communication is amazing. You just bring it out. You talk about the things that are important to you. Talk about some of the challenges. Like my husband would tell my son all the time, "We can't afford that. We can't afford that," even though I'd tell him not to. And there got to a point where my husband and I really did talk about this, because my son was coming back and saying, I would say simple things about money, and my son would say, "We can't afford that. We're broke." And I was like, wow, we're trying so hard to make them conservative that we're actually messing with them and creating a whole set of other issues. And what I had to do was sit the family down and say, here's the deal. We do have a certain amount of wealth, but we also want you to really respect these other things. And we're learning our way through it. And we're just going to fumble and we're going to mess up. But as long as this is an open conversation, it's not fair that Tim, my husband, says we're broke, but it's also not fair for us to imply that there's a limitless supply of money, because that's not what we're trying to show him. And so what's funny is because of realizing that there was actually a problem and us bringing it out and talking about it, I feel like my son has grown leaps and bounds over the past few years, because we just play with it, we talk about it, we joke about it, and nothing is off the table in the discussion.
Yeah, and like you said before, which I think is so important, the humility, right? To say, hey, I'm not perfect. Sure, I'm the parent, but we're just trying to figure this out. And the way that we view it is we're trying to figure this out as a family. So we try to talk through that. Obviously, we have fails like the one I talked about before, and that's part of life. But we do try to be open about things that we make mistakes about, or things we've done wrong in the past, or because showing them that we're humans and we're all just trying to get better, right? And I think it's fascinating to look at your story and see some of these awakening moments, and then the ways that you've changed dramatically. Like you, as I understand it, you picked up and took a trip for an entire year with your son, right? And your husband and your son. Your oldest was at college, and you picked up and sold everything, right? Like this is fantastic. Like how does that happen? Like how do you go from this seemingly hard charging, hey, I want to be a millionaire by the time I'm 35, all these things, right? Like, how did you change personally? Because this is a massive change in your life.
So we had been saving and working hard and living in this huge house. And one day I woke up, and I think it was because of me paying attention to all that we're talking about here. I had one of those moments where, oh my gosh, I'm still making money more important than anything. Is there more to life? And as I dove down that rabbit hole, I realized that I wanted to make some substantial changes in the way that we were living. We didn't need the 4,000 square foot, $1 million house anymore. We didn't need all this stuff. What would happen if we just walked away from it? What might our lives look like a year or two from now? And it took a while to convince my husband that this was a fun, interesting idea.
It's like there's adjectives that you could use, but fun was not at the top of the list.
He's like, wait, I built all of this for you. It's awesome. And he
literally built it, right?
Literally built this house, for us. And he's like, you just want to throw it all away? And I was like, maybe we need to think of it a little differently. So we came to a meeting of minds and we decided to do it. Let's sell it all. Let's get rid of everything. Let's go live out of a couple suitcases. Let's pull Aiden out of school. And honestly, I think it was my inspiration that started it. But it wasn't until we were halfway into the experience, or at least several months into it, where my husband was like, oh my gosh, this is what it's like to not just be driving forward all the time, to actually pause in life. I didn't even know I could do that. And that one moment alone was worth everything, because it changed the way that we approach our whole entire life now. Slowing down, rethinking, re-examining, and then making different choices going forward. And I'll tell you from a financial, because everyone here is thinking about, FI, and what ended up happening as a result is, before we had been consumers of our money, we had big expensive houses. It was all invested in those projects. And what ended up happening is we were able to take that nest egg that we had accumulated. And when we started to rebuild the life after that year off, we started creating investment, producing properties and other projects and things that would bring money in, where our money was now working for us rather than just consuming the money that we had. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it certainly does. And I mean, especially when you build up a lifestyle that, like you said, the $1 million house. I mean, just no matter how wealthy you are, no matter how much income you make, you can spend it, right? You can spend it. And if it's just going to sustain this lifestyle, instead of, to your point, for investment properties or other investments, other projects, things that are actually earning you money, thinking of your life as a business in that regard, like it is amazing how quickly it can go. And I just wanted to touch real quick. So, okay, you're at this point where, your money story, that's what we're talking about. Your identity was built around, hey, I want to be wealthy and I'm successful. You are wealthy, clearly. How did you get over that? And then decide, hey, we're gonna get rid of all these trappings of what make us look wealthy to other people, right? Because this is a part of it. You were in, I'm sure, a wealthy part of town with this, $1 million plus houses. Like, what do you tell? What do people ask you? Like, have you guys gone crazy? Are you having midlife crises? What are the conversations around this? And how did you reconcile that in your head, I guess?
A couple of things come to mind that I hope answer the question. One is when we built that kind of at the top of, the house and all of that stuff, when we built that, we had been working our way up, building houses and moving every few years. And when we got to that final house and people came over to see that house, they started treating us differently. And that was a big wake up call for me because I'm still that little girl who didn't have very much growing up. And now all of a sudden, people are treating me differently because they're seeing the outward show of money in a way that I don't think I really understood how it was going to affect friendships. And it hit me pretty hard, I'll be honest with you, because people didn't want to come over to our house. I think they felt like they were in competition or something. I don't even know. People didn't even talk about it. Talk about people, not being comfortable talking about money. Something happened. And it started making me look at like how I had built a life all about what did it look like to other people. And I think that began the crumbling over a period of years where I was like, you know what? This is actually not who I am. And it's not that important to me. Oh, and it's a lot of responsibility to have this big house and have all your money tied up in it. So I feel like it was a gradual process of one day realizing I didn't care at all about what other people thought. I really had like gone to the top of the mountain, looked at what it felt and looked like, and said, that's not really what I want. And I went back down and I'm like, this is a different life that I'm going to be really, really happy living. And I'm never going to hold this accountable to myself anymore. And also to my husband. Because by the way, my husband didn't really care about that stuff. It was all me.
Lisa, that's amazing. I have chills and I love that. You want people to appreciate you and want to be around you for you and when you're building this house, this dream house, you're trying to create a place that you want to be, your family want to be, that people come over and want to be. You don't want to create basically a wall around this little cubicle that you're creating for yourself, this very expensive cubicle. And so I just love, your epiphany, and I've definitely seen our own version of that. We don't want to live in a pillared house, right?
Definitely not.
We want a community, we want relationships, and we want to spend time with the people that we value. So with that in mind, I think people listening to this see the value in this conversation, and I think they'd be very open-minded to what a framework around these types of conversations would look like. And I believe that is specifically why you wrote the book that you wrote. So why don't you tell our audience a little bit about it and where they can find it?
So, The Mindful Millionaire was written about these stories that we're talking about here, about my own stories, about my clients' stories, about these epiphanies that we have about our money experiences, our relationship with money, how we can transform them into this thinking about money as a tool. Like, what does it take to get there? And what I wanted to do was create a pathway that helped people dive into this experience with money and journal it out, think about some of these questions that we've posed today so that you can come out on the other side being more self-aware, more confident, more ready to build the wealth that you want, not just the dollars and cents, but this sense of worthiness that I think, has been under the undercurrent of this conversation. How can we feel more worthy than all the money in the world? That's where the idea came from.
So the book is The Mindful Millionaire, and you can get your copy, I guess, anywhere the books are sold. And you can find it at mindfulmillionairebook.com. So Lisa, this has been a fun conversation. I've been so excited to have you on the show. And so thank you for joining us on the Choosify podcast.
Thank you both. This has been wonderful.
I think, Brad, for me, the big takeaway here is, words matter, language matter. Every when you're talking with your kids, what are they hearing? When you're interacting with your spouse about a medical bill, what are they hearing? What's coming back? What are the unintentional consequences about the anger or frustration you're feeling? Like, it may be a very temporary thing that in your mind, a week or two from now, it's not a big deal. But what are your loved ones hearing, and how is that going to change the way that they react with money? What are the unintentional consequences of your approach to these types of conversations?
Yeah, you're right. And it might just be something flippant, like, oh, we can't afford that candy bar, right? That's such an interesting example. Or obviously, in many cases, it could be legitimate scarcity, but it's better, as Lisa said, to have humility and to really talk through these conversations, be honest, right? Instead of the child or whoever it is, but let's say child in this case, hearing whispers of mom and dad arguing, there might be a way to bring your kids in and band together as a family and think of this as how are we going to overcome this issue, right? Like that to me feels like an empowering moment even amidst maybe financial difficulty, right? And then obviously Jonathan, as you said, like we, as you know, in our case, like there is clearly abundance, but how do you not make that its own issue, right? Like there is a balancing act for everybody here. But to your point, words matter. And I think at least the way that I approach this is it's important to be open, it's important to have humility, and more conversation is always better than less.
Let's say you're listening to this episode and this is kind of a gateway episode to you for the concept, the idea of financial independence. And you're working through these conversations, but you're working through these conversations through the lens of, I would like to be striving for financial independence. How do I get started? Let me encourage you today. Share this episode with a friend or family member that might be open to it. And then two, use it as a gateway to start the conversations, right? But then two, get started on your own path to financial independence. Go to choosefi.com/start. We've put all of our resources on this page for you to make it very easy for you to get started on your own path. And let me just, spoil this for you. It's worth it. Do it. Get started. All right, my friends, the fire is spreading. We'll see you next time as we continue to go down the road less traveled.